How concerned should we be that we will get a reacceleration in inflation as a result of the reacceleration we're seeing in the labor market?
Well, I'm definitely going to speak to that and respond to Larry's interesting comments as well. Larry is one of my good friends, and I always learn when we talk. But let me start by saying that I don't think you're ever going to see President Joe Biden step up to a microphone and say, darn it, we got too many jobs last month. This is a great jobs report. It's really important for Americans across the land from all walks of our labor market to have the kind of opportunities, persistent opportunities that this labor market is providing, with an unemployment rate below 4% for 26 months running. As we've documented extensively at the Council of Economic Advisors, persistently being at or near full employment is one of the best ways to make sure people get a fair slice of the growing pie that they're helping to bake. And one of the places you see that in today's report is on the wage story. And that's where I'd like to go in response to your question and to what Larry said. Wages are beating prices. Now, they beat prices for 10 months in a row. That's great to see on a year-over-year basis. We don't know March inflation yet, but the wage growth, 4.1%, very likely to have beaten price growth, of course, in March. So that'll make it 11 months. But those wages have been decelerating. They've been growing more slowly. So I mildly disagree with Larry when he says the economy is reaccelerating. When you actually look at the wage story, which is really the price component in here, it is not reaccelerating. So I think we have to get under the hood there a bit.
Well, that's very important here, Jared. If that's the case, you've been spending the last many months talking about sustainable, steady growth as opposed to something overheating that would require higher interest rates. Is this the definition of that when we're blowing the doors out with 100,000 payrolls more than expected?
I think so. I mean, I think, I noticed the headline, and I haven't read it yet, but David Miracle is really a very sharp macroeconomist at Goldman Sachs in the research group, and he put out a report today that was titled something like How You Can Have Strong Growth and Slower Inflation. And so a lot of that, of course, has to do with the improvements on the economy's supply side. Now, again, work that we've done at CEA finds that about 80% of the disinflation we've experienced and enjoyed so far, the fact that inflation is down 2/3 off of its peak, looks to us to come from largely from the economy's supply side, to some extent from cooling demand as well. So one of the questions we're really circling around here is there more room to run in terms of disinflation on the economy's supply side? One area where you see that happening, you just talked about it with your prior guest, is on labor supply, but also probably in the goods sector. I think that's probably the argument that Miracle is making in that piece when I get to read it this weekend.
Well, Jared, Chairman Powell actually made a similar argument when he spoke earlier this week. He talked about how the fact that growth has been so resilient may have a lot to do with the supply side. And I know that you do not comment on Fed policy. I'm not going to ask you if the Fed should cut rates or when they will. But as we consider what you're talking about here, steady growth, is it possible that the level of interest rates that this economy needs or will tolerate to maintain stasis, to be steady, is higher than it was before the pandemic when all of these supply shocks first hit?
Well, of course it's possible. And again, if you listen to some sage words from Larry, he talks about that all the time, saying the neutral rate of interest must be higher than folks think it is for the very reason you just took us through. However, there are what I would think of as post-pandemic economics that are still in play here. And so I think those who tell me that the long-run neutral interest rate hasn't gone up much, and I think the Fed would be in that category, they may have a point as well. I think you have to distinguish between near and longer term. Right now, though, I think it's really key to understand this picture, to not just look at the economy's demand side and not even look at just the jobs in today's report. Look at the wages as well. They're doing something very important from the perspective of the kitchen table. President Biden knows how important breathing room is for families, and they need real wage gains, and that's what they have been getting, and that's really important. We've got a lot more work to do to help cut costs. But that's right there in the data. At the same time, we've seen some slowing, some deceleration in nominal wage growth, whether it's in the report today or in the ECI, which is looked at more carefully. So again, I think those are all combinations of a steady, stable path forward.
Well, as long as we're not commenting on the Fed here, Jared, I do want to ask you about something we were just discussing before you joined us, and that's the unemployment rate for Black Americans, up to 6.4%, which is the high that we saw last August of 2022, as a matter of fact. And I talked to Lindsay Owens about this today, an economist at the Groundwork Collaborative, about the rise in Black unemployment. Here's what she said, and we'd love to have you respond. Let's listen.
What we should see in a full employment economy and a labor market this strong is actually a real strengthening of the labor market for Black workers, for women. When the labor market tightens up, that's usually when workers who employers might discriminate against in sort of looser labor market conditions bring folks off the sidelines. And so it is a little surprising to me to see that number tick up.
Jared, what's your thought? What's the thought of the White House on this? Is it a leading indicator? How do you feel?
I very much agree with the things Lindsay just said, and I think they're not just on point, but they have a very strong empirical basis. I think what's important is that we're achieving precisely the kinds of outcomes she was talking about just a few months ago. For the year of 2023, and that's important, I'm taking a yearly average, I'll get back to that in a second, the Black unemployment rate was the lowest on record, going back to when that series starts in the early 1970s. The Black-white gap, totally consistent with Lindsay's rap you just heard, lowest on record, Black-white unemployment gap. And so this very much was associated with persistent full employment. Now, the reason I took a yearly average there is because these numbers are very noisy month to month. I think Wally was right earlier in the clip that you played to emphasize the trend. Now, of course, we're going to watch something like the pop we saw there in March. We're going to watch that very carefully. But one point doesn't make a new trend in the data, especially when the more lasting trend is going in the other direction.
And Jared, finally, and it's so great of you to give us so much of your time from the North Lawn of the White House today. Of course, President Biden himself is not at the White House right now because earlier today he boarded Marine One and he went to Baltimore to see the collapsed Francis Scott Key Bridge. From an economic standpoint, how are you thinking about the ramifications of that event? Obviously, first and foremost, a human tragedy, but we are now talking about 100,000 jobs tied to the port that could be affected. Then there's going to be a reconstruction effort down the line, which could actually be somewhat of a growth catalyst. How do the economics balance out in your mind?
Well, first of all, I very much appreciate your starting from the perspective of human tragedy. Of course, we're going to talk about the economic impacts, but that is absolutely the right place to start. Those workers filling potholes on the bridge in the dark of night, really a very deep tragedy there. Turning to the economics, I think it's been very impressive to see the extent to which the Unified Command, leaders from the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers are already up and running. My understanding is that there's already a one-way path there out of the harbor, or at least soon to be. And I think we've heard the prediction that they may be able to get this running by the end of May in terms of fully restoring the pathway out of Port Baltimore. At the same time, there's 15,000 direct jobs. You cited the indirect number. And so we've been working hard with folks on the ground to try to find ways to retain employment there. We scanned very carefully the UI claims data from Thursday to see if there was anything there yet we could see. We didn't really see much yet, but we'll continue to watch that. Very happy to see the repair process underway, though.